Okay, so we are just about done with the term here, right? After today, we only have 3 more class meetings. So for next time, you are reading these essay excerpts from the Nation, Race, and Language section, right? Friday, the annotated bibliography is due. And a week from Thursday, or not 2 weeks from Thursday, a week from Thursday is Thanksgiving. 2 weeks from Thursday, our last class session will be a review session for the exam, right? So bring any questions that you have about the material, and we'll talk them through, okay? So the whole idea will be to help you get you better prepared for the final exam. Now, did everybody get the sample exam questions that I sent out? Okay, so let me give you some advice on how to effectively study for this exam, right? Since we still have a little bit of time. So for the essay portion, right? You're going to be given 3 questions to choose from. I've given you 4. On the sample sheet, right? You will select 2 on the final exam to answer. So, what should you do with these 4 questions then, right? Well, first off, you will be well prepared for the exam if you feel you are prepared to answer 3 of them, right? Any 3. And in order to prepare to answer them, what you ought to do is look over the questions carefully and think about which specific texts that we've talked about might fit these questions, right? Which texts throughout the whole course of the semester can I apply to these particular questions? And you will want to practice comparing and contrasting these specific texts and the way they approach the problem posed by the sample question, right? So if you are able to slot in a few different texts to 3 of the sample questions, then you will be in good shape, right? Now, 2 things to remember, right? 1, remember that the questions are comparative, right? This is a place where some of you screwed up on the midterm. Some of you only focused on 1 text when the question was clearly asking you to compare 2, right? So make sure that you read the questions carefully. And that you remember that all the questions are asking you to make a comparison. Right. All the questions are going to be asking you to weigh 2 texts against each other. So does anybody have a guess? Alex, go ahead.
Are these going to be like short essay questions, or are they both full length?
So these will both require a roughly 500-word response.
Okay. To each of them?
To each of them. Got it? So once again, like, practice writing these answers out, right, in essay form to make sure you're able to generate enough to say. Because that was another place where a lot of you, now, some of you actually probably would have done better and found more to say if you'd done the comparison and not just focused on one text. But remember, yeah, like just, you know, practice while you still have access to your materials, because that will reinforce the information, right? Remember, the test won't be open book or open notes, so use your book and use your notes to study and to practice before the exam, right? We've still got plenty of time before the exam to do this. Yes?
Okay, I know like how you said that a lot of us make that mistake on the midterm, like when we were comparing stuff, but I thought when you're comparing something, don't you start from for say I'm comparing two stories, don't you start talking about the first story, then the second story, then you start talking about how they relate? And that how you do it, or no, that's not what you want?
That is one thing that you can do. That's a strategy that you can use, right? The problem that not everyone, but most of you had on the midterm exam was that you only talked about one text and you didn't do any comparison. So I don't remember who specifically did that, but it was a general problem, right? So just remember, yeah, that is one strategy you can use to do a compare-contrast. Just remember, all I'm asking is that you remember that you have to do the compare-contrast part of this, right?
Yeah, because that's, like you said, how it has to be 500 words.
Uh-huh.
That's probably what I did on the midterm too. Like, I started comparing one of them, and I'm like, well, I know I want to put as much as possible, not just put anything, but I want to put as much as possible. But then, of course, like you said, we was on a time limit, so we might not have time to go compare 1 and 2. Like you said, we might just compare one and then just jump straight to the comparison without explaining 2.
Sure.
That's probably what I did.
And this is one of the reasons why I'm saying, like, practice beforehand, right? The more practice you get before you have to do it on the exam, the easier it's going to be. So, yeah, if you're better prepared and you've got more information up here and you're not relying on the book and the notes, then this will be easier to complete. Okay, any other questions about the essay portion? Yeah, Alex?
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
One, will they be graded similarly to the response papers?
Yes.
Okay. And I know you said it was December 10th, but what time did you say it was happening?
I believe it's 10:30 to 12:30.
Yeah, you had it 10:30 to 12:30.
Yeah, and you know, and like I don't set those times. Those times are set by the administration, right? You know, and the exam time is always based on when the time when the class meets, right? So every class that meets from what time we from 11 to 12:15 is having their exam at the same time. So there should be no overlap or conflicts. Yes.
And I know, like, you were talking about the essay proportion, but I think you already answered my question, like how it was on a midterm, where you gave us a list of terms and you wanted us to, like, not define them, but...
Oh, I do want you to define them. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the second part of the exam is that identification portion, right?
Okay, I just want to make sure you were going to do that again.
Oh, yeah. No, the format will be the same, but because you have more time, the test will be slightly longer, right? So the ID portion is going to work the same way, but you'll have 15 to choose from, and you will pick 10. Yes?
Did you want those to be a certain length in order to be like up to par, or just as long as we know what they are?
Give me at least a few sentences.
And,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, and like I know, like last time we were saying, like some of us kind of had it confused on what you were looking for when you wanted us to identify certain terms. So what do you want us to put? Not saying give you the answer, of course not, but what are you looking for? Since I know you said last time we didn't really do too good on that part, but some of us didn't give it.
Okay, so here's what I'm looking for with the IDs, right? So first off, in terms of the things that you will be asked to identify, right? You may be asked to identify characters, important places or objects, or important historical or theoretical concepts. So these are the things you should be looking for in your notes, right? And in terms of answering these questions, right, what I want is I want the name of the relevant text, and the name of the author of that text. Now that means that for some, there may be more than one right answer, right? So just give me one potential answer if that's the case, right? So for example, if I ask you about the Atlantic Trade Triangle, right? There are a couple of texts that we read that would be relevant to. Just give me one, right? So, if you just give me Olguda Equiano's interesting narrative, right? Then that would be sufficient for that. You don't have to give me all the texts that would be relevant. But I'm also going to want you to provide a brief but substantial definition that tells me what this is and why it's important. So, for example, say that I ask you to identify Gabriel Conroy. Okay, let's start with the text and the author.
It's by James Joyce.
Yes, good. The Dead by James Joyce. All right. And who is Gabriel Conroy, or what is Gabriel Conroy?
He was a character in the book.
Okay, he's a character in the story.
He was one of the main characters. Can we say something like that, or?
Okay, he's the perspective character, right? And you would also have to give me some important details about him, right? So, what is Gabriel Conroy like? Why is he important? Why does he matter? Right? Not just because he's the perspective character of the Dead, right? But you have to tell me a little bit more about him, right? So, Gabriel shows little interest in his, in his home country until he has an epiphany at the end of the story, right?
I was going to say, towards the end of the story, you start to find out more about him than you did before. Like you said, more things start to come out about him towards the end.
Yeah, well, really, it's more than he's learning things about himself, right?
Yeah.
So, there are things that he hadn't really thought of either. But yeah, so that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for, right? Don't just tell me this is the main character, the perspective character, right? I need some details. Yes?
What if we can think of the author or just think of the title, but we forget the other part?
Then you get, so because there's 10 of these, and each will be worth 4 points, right? The IDs are worth 40% of the grade. You'll get 1 point for getting the title right, 1 point for getting the author right, and then 2 points for the definition, right? So if you get the author and the title, but you can't remember what it is, then you get half credit for that answer.
Yeah, because I'm more better with remember the title of the book than who wrote it, unless I'm used to reading a lot of stuff by the author, even if I do memorize it.
Okay, well,
I can remember it good.
Yeah,
well,
if you tell me who wrote it.
and this is what I'm saying. This is the advice that I always give classes. What you ought to do is, as you are going, and you can kind of work on studying for these portions together, right? As you're going through texts and studying for the essay portion, look for anything that looks like it might be a good ID question, right? Especially if it's something that we spend a good bit of time talking about in class, right? In general, I'm not going to pull things out that we didn't discuss in class, right? And make a flashcard, right? Put the term on one side, like get a bunch of index cards, put the term on one side, put the author name, the text name, the definition on the other side. And just test yourself with those. And the more of those you can remember, the better you will do on this portion of the exam. So, and this is the thing, guys. So historically, most students have done fine on my final exams. But you got to put in a little elbow grease here, right? You got to study for it. You got to put in a little bit of work. It's not going to be the kind of exam you can just kind of show up for and prepare on the day of, and things will be fine. Any other questions? Okay, then let's talk about Jean Rhys. What did you think of this story?
Good. I like it.
Okay, what did you like about it?
It reminded me of the story I read before. It was like something Fahrenheit. It reminded me of that book.
Oh, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it was the book burning portion of that was familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, yeah, in Bradbury's novel, like Bradbury's describing like a kind of near future society, right?
Yeah.
Where certain types of information literature are banned. Right, so yeah, he's describing kind of specific act of censorship there, right? And I think that there is an act of censorship happening in the book burning here as well. But the book burning here is the book burning and selling here is also kind of act of vengeance, right? So what do you notice about, like, what struck you about these particular characters or about this particular situation, apart from the familiarity that those of you who might have read Fahrenheit 451 would have experienced?
Some of the character names sound familiar to the ones in the book. Like in Fahrenheit 451, they had Mildred in that book too.
Okay.
And like you said, something similar, like as far as like burning the books and stuff like that. That was just what stood out to me.
Okay.
And the title of the reading. I think that was a chapter in the book or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I remember.
Anything else that struck you guys about the situation described here or the characters described?
I was surprised that the mom, I don't remember her name, but the wife had so much patience in the marriage because I just didn't expect her to be so angry afterwards because she had so much patience throughout her marriage.
But there are hints that she's waiting and biding her time throughout, right? If we look, so yeah, Mrs. Sawyer's relationship here to her husband is complicated. Right? If we look on page 723, there's this incident at the dinner party, right? The story went that once they had ventured to give a dinner party, and when the servant, Mildred, was bringing in coffee, he, Mr. Sawyer, had pulled Mrs. Sawyer's hair. Not a wig, you see, he bawled. Even then, if you can believe it, Mrs. Sawyer had laughed and tried to pretend that it was all part of the joke, this mysterious, obscure, sacred English joke. But Mildred told the other servants in the town that her eyes had gone wicked like a Cyprien's eyes, and afterwards she had picked up some of the hair he had pulled out and put it in an envelope, and that Mr. Sawyer ought to look out. Hair is obeah as well as hands. So the two terms here that the servant uses, suppliant and obeah, come out of West Indian folklore, right? So suppliant is a creature that is like a vampire. And do any of you know what obeah is?
I only know the description of it.
Okay, yeah, it's essentially what it is. It's West Indian folk magic. So Mrs. Sawyer's behavior looks different to different audiences, right? The guests at the dinner party, who we can assume are probably by and large other white English people, don't notice what Mildred, the servant, notices, right? And what do we know about Mrs. Sawyer's social position and her ethnic background?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, she's black and was she a teacher? Not a teacher, but
Yeah, it doesn't. It never says what she does for a living, right?
Yeah, I'm finna say, I think I was trying to remember, I was like, did he say she did something?
Okay, I think now on page 723, they talk about the surprise, how surprised people were that Mr. Sawyer married a colored woman, though a decent, respectable, nicely educated colored woman, mind you. Now, in this particular context, colored means mixed race. Right? Usually, in British colonial contexts, if someone is described as colored or as half-caste being the derogatory term, it means that they are mixed race. So, Mrs. Sawyer has her foot in two worlds and isn't really part of either, right? Which is something we kind of see happening with her son Eddie as well. In fact, it's something we see kind of happening with most of the characters in the story. And it might be a good idea if we talk a little bit here about general context. So, do any of you know where Dominica is?
Say Dominican?
No, Dominica, not the Dominican Republic.
Oh.
That's not where this is taking place. Dominican Republic is on the other half of the island that Haiti occupies, right? And Haiti was French territory, the Dominican Republic was Spanish territory. Dominica is a small island north of Venezuela. So I'll call on a map up here. I'll show you exactly where it is. So here's Florida, here's Cuba, here's Puerto Rico, Venezuela's down here. Dominica is right here. It's right in the middle of this island chain, right? We have the Windward Islands down to the south and the Leeward Islands to the north. Most of these islands changed hands a number of times throughout the 17th and 18th centuries between the British and the French. Dominica ended up in British hands. And Dominica is very, very small, like most of these islands. So the current population of Dominica is about 70,000 people, which, to put that into perspective, is about twice the population of Sumter County. So this is a tiny place, right? This is a small place. Now, Dominica in the 19th century resembled, in terms of demographics, much of the rest of the British Caribbean, right? You had a black majority population who were free after the 1830s, at least legally, and a white planter minority. right? The primary industry on Dominica, as was the case in much of the rest of the Caribbean, was sugar production, right? So there were a lot of sugar plantations on Dominica. Now, there's also kind of vexed racial history, which is not surprising in a place like Dominica. Because even after the black majority is set free, the white planter minority still holds most of the power. Right? For a time, Dominica has an elected assembly that is dominated by free blacks. But when the white planters complain about this to authorities back in England, it's then once again directly governed by the crown for the benefit of that white planter minority, right? So you have a traditionally disempowered majority that has been held back and kept down by a small minority. Dominica, by the way, it's an independent country now, but it did not achieve its independence until 1978. So this story is written and published in 1960, but it's describing events that would have happened probably about 50 years earlier, when Dominica was very much firmly in British colonial hands, under British colonial administration, right? So that should provide a little bit of context here for the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Sawyer, right? Now, what about Mr. Sawyer? What is Mr. Sawyer like? What does the story tell us about him?
They were saying like he was a strange person and they couldn't.
Well, what's strange about it?
Like he didn't have like they didn't know, he didn't have like a regular job, I guess, or I think they were saying they was trying to figure out what he do for a living.
It actually does tell us on page 723 that what he does, right?
He wasn't he wasn't what people consider a gentleman based on his job.
Yeah, that's how.
Yeah. I think what do we know? Do we understand what's meant here by gentleman? What a gentleman is?
He didn't have a great paying job, but like he wasn't.
It's probably like the field that he was in, they probably was saying like a lot of men don't do that particular job, like the ones they suggested.
I'm just going to stop you guys here. I'm going to remind everybody a little bit about how class works in the British system, right? Now, when we think about kind of our early discussions about social class, right? So in the U.S., we tend to connect social class to income. That's not really done so much in Europe, right? Your income doesn't matter. What matters is your family background and education, right? And where your family's money ultimately comes from. Not so much as how much of it there is, right?
Oh, so you're saying like they were used to everyone in his family having a good job, and then he just had like the job that he has, which wasn't like what they was used to.
Well, think about this. If you're a gentleman, right? Is that a position that you attain or a position you inherit? Yeah, it's inherited, right? So if he's not a gentleman, what that means is that his origins are more humble, right? You know, we're told in that first paragraph where he's described on page 723 that he hasn't an H in his composition, right? What that means is that, when he speaks, he drops his H's, which to a British person would indicate a working class upbringing, right? Working class people in Britain tend to drop their H's. it's not so much, like when people can't figure out what he's doing in that part of the world, that doesn't have to do with his job, right? The next paragraph tells us exactly what his job is. He was an agent for a small steamship line, which in those days linked up Venezuela and Trinidad with the smaller islands. Right, so he is connected with shipping, right? Now, given some of the stuff we've discussed in class thus far, right? What does this recall for us? Like, why might it matter that we have this Englishman in the Caribbean who makes his money from shipping, particularly from shipping between the islands and the South American mainland, right? What's this meant to recall?
It reminds me of like all the slave trades and stuff like that.
Yes. It's a reference to the trade triangle, right? Right? It is significant here that Mr. Sawyer's job is in shipping, is in moving people and things back and forth between the smaller islands and the mainland, right?
And this was still, that slave trade stuff was still going on in this little...
No, it would have been very much illegal by this point.
That's not
But we're not meant to read that literally. It's more of like a kind of symbolic resonance, right? That, you know, this is meant to remind us of the Atlantic trade triangle, right? It's not literally the same thing.
okay.
But yeah, especially when we combine this with Mr. Sawyer's attitudes on matters of race, right? So he's married to a mixed race woman, but how does he seem to feel about people of color generally?
He doesn't really care for them?
Yeah, I mean, he's cruel to his wife as well, right? Lower down page 723, right, when Mr. Sawyer was drunk, this often happened. He used to be very rude to her. She never answered him. Look at the N-word showing off, he would say, and she would smile as if she knew she ought to see the joke but couldn't. You damned, long-eyed, gloomy half-caste, you don't smell right, he would say. And she never answered, not even to whisper, you don't smell right to me either. And then there's the story of the dinner party where he pulls her hair to show everybody that it's real, right? Now, why is he able to get away with talking like this to her, and why does she simply take it silently?
All the people at the dinner party were white as well, so they probably had the same general thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, colonial power dynamics here still apply, right? You know, Mr. Sawyer may himself be a working class person who doesn't make a lot of money at his job, but he's still more closely related to the dominant class than she is, right? His Britishness gives him privileges that she does not share, right? That she does not enjoy. So he's able to do things to her and get away with it. And the only revenge that she can get is on the sly, right? So, you know, this whole, you know, hiding the hair and using it for Obeah, right? You know, it's sort of hinted that, you know, this kind of thing might be partly responsible for his sudden death. But any revenge that she gets has to be gotten in secret, right? Now, let's talk a little bit here about the children, who are also a big part of this, right? Because everything is being seen here through their eyes. Right? So we have on the one hand our narrator, who's never named.
Oh, I thought the narrator was the girl, because since she said my friend Eddie, I just assumed it was her.
Okay, and yeah, so just remember what I've always warned everybody about biography, right? Always, like even first-person narrators, read them as a character, not as the author, right? While the author may be drawing on her own experiences, this is not autobiography, this is fiction. So we're treading into dangerous territory if we read the narrator as just a stand-in for the author. She's a separate character. So, this narrator, what do we know about her?
She's not really relevant to the story except for to tell the story through her perspective.
Okay, yeah, she's an observer, right? More than a participant in the action. Although she does steal one of the books as well, right? When Eddie does. And I would argue that even though she is mostly an observer here, her social position and her relationship to Eddie actually are really relevant to the action here. So most of the obvious action is between Eddie and his parents, right? But what do we know about the narrator's social position?
She's one of Eddie's best friends.
Okay, yeah, so Eddie's her best friend, right? What else do we know about her?
Isn't she white?
Yeah, she is white.
I thought she was mixed. Well,
Well, she is mixed in the sense that her descent is not purely English, right? She talks about having French and Spanish blood as well, which she thinks makes her more interesting than someone who is purely English. But this also gives the purely English people she interacts with reason to make fun of her, right? And to talk down to her, right? They call her at one point a horrid colonial. And this is another example of the kind of intricacies of these colonial class systems, right? On the one hand, people of color tended to be at the very bottom of the system, right? And people, like white people, whatever their overall heritage, were placed above them in these colonial caste systems, right? But white people from England, or who could proclaim pure English descent, were socially superior to people who were born in the colonies, right? Particularly if those people who were born in the colonies were not themselves purely English, right? So, if we look on page 724, these children are talking, the children are talking about their relationship to England, right? And they're thinking about England, right? It was Eddie with the pale blue eyes and straw-colored hair, the living image of his father, though often as silent as his mother, right? The story really stresses his inheritance from both parents, right? He looks like his father, but he acts like his mother. Who first infected me with doubts about home, meaning England. So that's one thing to note, is the description of home, not as the place where she actually is from, right? But as England, right? Home being the mother country rather than the actual country of her birth. He would be so quiet when others who had never seen it, none of us had ever seen it, We're talking about its delights, gesticulating freely as we talked. London, the beautiful rosy-cheeked ladies, the theaters, the shops, the fog, the blazing coal fires in winter, the exotic food, whitebait eaten to the sound of violins, strawberries and cream. The word strawberry is always spoken with a guttural and throaty sound which we imagine to be the proper English pronunciation. I don't like strawberries, Eddie said on one occasion. You don't like strawberries? No, and I don't like daffodils either. Dad's always going on about them. He says they lick the flowers here into a cocked hat, and I bet that's a lie. So, how likely is it that any of these children have ever eaten a strawberry or seen a daffodil?
0.
Pardon?
0.
Yeah. In fact, she admits like they're talking about something that they know absolutely nothing about. They know that because they're English, they're supposed to like these things, right? But these things have no direct relationship to their own experience. And we're going to see the daffodils thing pop up again when next time. In fact, just about everyone that I've ever heard speak about colonialism who was educated in a British colonial system talks about daffodils, right? And how they had to read all these poems about daffodils, and nobody in the class had any fucking clue what a daffodil was because they'd never seen one, right? It was just kind of expected that they know what this thing is. And because it's European, because it's English, it's supposed to be better, right? So Eddie saying that he doesn't like strawberries or daffodils makes him a kind of class traitor, right? The fact that he doesn't like these things that are specifically English and is instead aligning himself with things that are Dominican, right? We were all too shocked to say, you don't know a thing about it. We were so shocked that nobody spoke to him for the rest of the day. But I, for one, admired it. I also was tired of learning and reciting poems in praise of daffodils, and my relations with the few real English boys and girls I had met were awkward. I had discovered that if I called myself English, they would snub me haughtily. You're not English, you're a hard colonial. Well, I don't much want to be English, I would say. It's much more fun to be French or Spanish or something like that. As a matter of fact, I am a bit. Then I was too killingly funny, quite ridiculous. Not only a hard colonial, but also ridiculous. Heads I win, tails you lose. That was the English. I had thought about all this, and thought hard, but I had never dared to tell anybody what I thought, and I realized that Eddie had been very bold. Now let's stop at this phrase for a second here. Heads I win, tails you lose. That was the English. What does she mean here?
Maybe only English people know of this thing or know of this phrase.
Think about what the phrase means. What does heads I win, tails you lose mean?
She's flipping a coin.
Yeah, you're flipping a coin, right? And if you say heads I win, tails you lose, is there any way you can win?
No.
Yeah, right? Basically, if I say heads I win, tails you lose, I win either way, and you lose either way, right? So what she's saying is that when you are dealing with the English, right, there's no way to get one over. Like, they're going to mock you and make fun of you, no matter what you do or how you respond to them, because you're only a hard colonial, right? So she is also in this kind of in-between stage, right? This in-between class.
I just really got what you just said.
What's that?
I just really thought about it. Because if it lands on head, you lose, and if it lands on tail, you lose.
Yeah, if I win, you lose. And if you lose, I win,
I
right?
didn't think about it.
Yeah, I never looked at it like that either.
Yeah. But that's the thing. Like, again, we gotta pay attention to these little nuances of language, right? You know, this kind of thing matters. Right? The way this is phrased is important for understanding how she views the English who live on the island, right? Now, what is at the center of contention here? Like, what is the thing that brings the story to its crisis? What has Mr. Sawyer been doing over the course of his life
Studying
that
and
becomes...
reading books.
Yeah, well, he's buying books, right? We don't know necessarily what he's doing with them, except that he's filling bookshelves with them, right? Yeah, we have no evidence that he's actually reading them. But he's getting them by the crate load, right? And filling up these bookshelves in the back room of his house. And what do we make of the titles here? Like, what kinds of books do we have here? If we look on page 725, the Encyclopedia Britannica, British Flowers, Birds and Beasts, Froude's English in the West Indies. We'll get to that in a second. I'll talk about that in a second. And then the poetry shelf, right? Lord Byron, Milton, Christina Rossetti. What do we notice about the kinds of books that Mr. Sawyer is primarily collecting?
They kind of catered to his narrative.
Yeah, they're all very, very English, right? They're all very much about or very much sort of tied into English culture and the English view of the world. The Encyclopedia Britannica, right? British Flowers, Birds and Beasts. And Froude's English in the West Indies might seem like an odd choice here because he seems to hate the West Indies so much, right? But I want to look briefly at what Froude actually wrote about the West Indies. So this is in the Victorian Age book. It was one of the ones that we were going to look at when we talked about colonialist texts in the Victorian era, but we didn't really get to it. So this is what Froude has to say about what he calls the West Indian Negro, right? As life goes, he has been a lucky mortal. He was taken away from Dahomey and Ashanti, to be a slave indeed, but a slave to a less cruel master than he would have found at home. He had a bad time of it occasionally, and the plantation whip and the branding irons are not all dreams. Yet his owner cared for him at least as much as he cared for his cows and horses. Kind usage to animals is more economical than barbarity, and Englishmen in the West Indies were rarely inhuman. So we can get some sense from that of Froude's arguments and his attitudes, right? That he's talking about these people as though they're livestock. And he's playing down the cruelty of their treatment to promote the benefits that they've received from having lived in a British dominion, right? So even the one book that Mr. Sawyer has collected from, that seems to relate to an actual West Indian context is a deeply racist one, right? That is mostly concerned with a kind of apologia for British behavior in the West Indies. Pardon?
What does that word mean?
Okay, so an apologia Think about what word looks like. Yeah, apology, right? But not apology in the sense that you're actually saying you're sorry. Apology in the sense that you are sort of claiming that what you did and believed was already right and good. So an apologia is more like a justification. So, like, if you hear, like, for example, that somebody is an apologist for something, like say, like, an apologist for authoritarian regimes, right? What that means is that they are someone who tries to justify things that other people might regard as unjustifiable, right? Does this make sense? Everybody with me? Okay, good. So, what's Mrs. Sawyer doing with all of these books?
She's sorting them out.
Yeah, she's sorting them. And for what purpose? What's she doing to her husband's library?
I thought she said she didn't burn them. She was getting rid of them.
Yeah, she's getting rid of all the books, right? So there's a so she's sorting them into 2 piles. Right? One to sell and one to burn. Right? The nice, handsome, leather-bound volumes that might fetch a decent price. The collectible-looking books she wants to sell. Pardon?
She wants to sell them.
Yeah. And those that don't look like they're saleable, she wants to burn. Now, what's Eddie's response to this? And in what way is it maybe a little bit surprising?
He didn't think it was a point for burning them. He didn't find like no point in it.
Well, why is he specifically upset about the destruction of this library? If we look on page 725 as they're splitting up the books, right? Mrs. Sawyer did not seem to notice that we were there, but she was breathing free and easy, and her hands had got the rhythm of tearing and pitching. She looked beautiful, too. Beautiful as the sky outside, which was a very dark blue, or the mango tree, long sprays of brown and gold. When Eddie said no, she did not even glance at him. No, he said again in a high voice. Not that one. I was reading that one. She laughed, and he rushed at her, his eyes starting out of his head, shrieking, "Now I've got to hate you, too. Now I hate you, too." He snatched the book out of her hand and gave her a violent push. She fell into the rocking chair. Why does he respond like this to seeing his mother dividing up and destroying his father's library? I'm sorry?
He was reading something, wasn't he?
Yeah, at least that's the reason he gives, right? But why is his response to this so violent, right? Why does he shout at his mother, "Now I've got to hate you too"? Who does that suggest he already hated?
His dad.
Yeah, it suggests he already hated his father, right? And think about what the books represent and what Mrs. Sawyer's relationship to that is, right? What did we notice was the common thread with all those books? All very much about England, right? And so Mrs. Sawyer, who is Dominican and doesn't give a shit about England, right? And, has been badly treated by her English husband, is destroying all of these reminders of English culture and learning and science, right? Right? Fuck England, right? England can go burn. But what does that mean then to Eddie, who is half Dominican and half English?
Oh, it kind of seemed like when his dad was doing it to his mom, it felt like to Eddie, it probably seemed like his dad was not caring about that side, and then when his mom burned the books, it seemed like she doesn't care about that side, and he's both of them.
Yeah, so what happens when the oppressed becomes the perceived oppressor, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you're doing
Exactly.
the same kind of nasty things that he used to do, right? Now I've got to hate you too. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought Eddie, he wasn't too much of a fan of the Caribbean either, or was that someone else that said that?
Well, Eddie is the one who hates England, right? He hates strawberries, he hates daffodils, he hates things that people associate with England. He looks like his father, but he's silent like his mother, right? So he's got these two sides to his heritage, right? And his mother is in the process of erasing one half of that. And this is what sends him into a rage, right? Now, I think it is also kind of interesting and important to focus on the books that Eddie tends to select from his father's library. First off, what's the book that he and the narrator choose to borrow from his father and to center their imaginary play around near the beginning of the story?
Wasn't it the Arabian Nights?
Yeah, they borrow the Arabian Nights and they play it being a sheep and his lady, right? Now, why do you think the Arabian Nights might be a significant choice here? How is it different from all of those other books in the library?
It said it was largely Persian, Arabian, and Indian origin.
Yeah, so there's still that lingering kind of colonial context, right? But there's no direct connection there to either England or Dominica, right?
Yeah.
So when they're participating in, childish fantasy play, right? They choose a place, they choose a location that seems far away from either pole of their heritage, right? Because remember, these are two kids who are of kind of in-between status, right? The narrator is white, but is a hard colonial. And Eddie looks white, but his pale skin is frequently emphasized, right? And straw-colored hair. But he is mixed race. So they occupy this kind of weird middle ground in the society. And so when they're playing imaginary games, they choose a location that is outside of the normal bounds, right? Now, what about the books that they steal? What are the books that they steal from the burn pile?
Cam and Fort Cone.
I was just gonna say the French.
That's the one that she gets, right? So we'll start by talking here a little bit about Kim. So we've read Kipling before, right? We read The Man Who Would Be King. And we know that Kipling himself was a kind of colonialist and British supremacist, right? Now Kim specifically is a novel about an Irish orphan who is kind of like making his way through Indian society. And kind of like sort of like trying to find his path in India, both kind of like recollecting his own family's past and trying to adjust to the new context that he's in. So there's a direct relevance there to Eddie's situation, right? The basic plot of the novel seems actually kind of similar to where to Eddie's position in the world. But what does Eddie note about the book? What state is the book in?
It's torn. And it's
Yeah.
on page 20.
It got torn. It starts at page 20 now. The beginning of the book has been mutilated, right? All right, there's no way now to know how it starts.
Oh, I thought that was the French book, or was the French book tore up also?
No, it was just in French. And she couldn't.
Yeah. I was very disappointed because it was in French and seemed dull. For comme la mort, it was called. Right? Strong as death. So,
You know what the book meant?
yeah, it's in the footnote.
That-
Always read the footnotes, guys. Always read the
But that
footnotes.
title don't even sound
Yeah,
nothing like what you just said.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because it's in French, right?
It sounded like a war or something. I was thinking like it was the title of like a war, maybe, or like a castle. I don't know.
But strong as death?
Mhm.
No, I'm saying.
Yeah, no, but yeah, well, yeah, I mean, okay, so our word fort, right, comes actually from the same root as the French word F-O-R-T, which means strength, right? So a fort or a fortress is a strong place, right? So the two words are actually related. And mort, right? Mort means death in French. So think about, again, it comes from the same Latin root as, our words like, mortician, right? Mortuary, things like that. We have all those words that are concerned with death that begin with that prefix M-O-R-T, right? But I think what's most interesting here about this is it's less what the title means and more what the book means to her, right? When the English people call her a hard colonial, what does she say about herself to defend herself? Let's go back to that passage on page 724, right? I had discovered that if I called myself English, they would snub me haughtily. You're not English, you're a hard colonial. Well, I don't much want to be English, I would say. It's much more fun to be French or Spanish or something like that. And as a matter of fact, I am a bit. So she's saying that it's more interesting to be French or Spanish than it is to be English, right? But then what's her reaction to picking up this French book?
She didn't like it.
Yeah, she says it was in French and seemed dull, right?
French is a little more harder to learn than most languages. Like Spanish is more easier to catch on to than like French is.
Well, but I think it's not so much here about the language or the difficulty of the language, right? She never indicates whether she can actually read French or not. What is interesting here is, she was talking about how much more interesting it makes a person to have that kind of, mixed heritage, right? But then she's disappointed when she gets the French book and not an English book, right? She picks one of the few books in the library that's not concerned with England, right? And what's going on here, right? What's important about this is it shows this kind of vexed relationship that a hard colonial like her has with the mother country, right? She can talk all she wants, like she and Eddie can reject the mother country all they want, right? But there's something about it that's kind of like a preemptive rejection, right? It's like, I give you the finger before you can tell me off, right? I didn't want to be part of your club anyway. But it's still a constant reminder that you're excluded from the club. That you don't get to play. You don't get to join. Now, there's one more thing that I do want to note here. we've managed to pull an awful lot out of these 4 or 5 pages here, right? This is actually, it's not a difficult story to read and comprehend, but there's a hell of a lot going on here.
Yeah.
What does Eddie look like on the top of page 726?
He was real pale,
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
Uh-huh.
and it says he had on a sailor suit,
Yeah.
and he looks just like his father.
His father's sneer was clamped on his face, right? He looked white as a ghost in his sailor suit, a blue white even in the setting sun, and his father's sneer was clamped on his face. So, think about, like, not just the father's sneer, but what the sailor suit here represents. What did his father do for a living?
He was standing.
Yeah, he worked in shipping, right? And that job that he has is meant to recall the old Atlantic trade triangle, right? So Eddie wearing the sailor suit and his father's sneer relates him back to that idea as well, right? So, while he is, Eddie, the narrator's playmate, Mrs. Sawyer's son, who hates England and hates his father, right? This is part of his legacy, too. This is also part of what he inherits and what's on his shoulders. Right. The sailor suit and the sneer of the conqueror and the slave trader. All right, so that's really all I have for you guys. We're kind of running close to time here now anyway. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? So this is kind of where we're going to, this kind of stuff is more or less where we're going to be for the last couple of class sessions, right? So we're going to be talking next time about language in particular, in relation to colonialism. And then our final class session, when we'll have our last presentation group, is going to be on colonial poetry, right? Or, poetry by British immigrants.
Will we ever, we're not going to end up getting to the 3rd book, are we not, with the time that we have?
We've been in the 3rd book.
Oh, I thought,
Yeah.
wasn't there a book in between that?
Yeah.
We are.
I lost track.
We used all 3. I wouldn't make you buy all 3 if you weren't going to use all 3.
It didn't seem like it went by real quick.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. No, this has been a weird semester. Yeah. But yeah, we have definitely we've definitely used all 3 books and used them a lot.
Oh, okay. I was like, ain't it one more book that we have to read?
Okay, so yes, let's just get cleaned up and get you set to go.